CGTN, China Global Television Network.
As protests over George Floyd's death in police custody continue across the United States, people around the world have begun marching in solidarity with Americans who have taken to the streets. Why have protests gone global? How should we view the idea of lifting Mr. Floyd up as a hero? And what will be the legacy of its death? And to discuss these issues and more, I'm pleased to be joined by Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center of China and Globalization, Thomas Rushkin, President of CMP Protective Investigative Group, Kimberly Brown-Pelham, Assistant Professor of History at Florida A&M University, and Mary C. Curtis, columnist at Roll Call. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Why don't we start with you, Andy? George Floyd's case is certainly not the first one in the U.S. and probably won't be the last. But why have there been so many cases like Floyd's before, and this one caused such intense protests this time and spreading all around the world?
Well, you're right, Zhou. I mean, this is really an American tragedy that some have referred to as America's original sin, of which there were two. The genocide of the Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans. And this treatment of African Americans has persisted, and one manifestation of that are the unjustified killings, really murders, really by the domestic security forces, or otherwise known as the police, in the United States. Whether this will continue or not, I think remains to be seen, because one of the big changes is the rise of social media, as well as the ubiquity of smartphones. So we've seen in the last couple of years the African Americans that have been killed either while being pulled over for a traffic stop, while jogging, or being accused of a petty crime like passing a counterfeit $20 bill. Really has made these images unavoidable and has forced, I think in particular, white Americans to confront really this profound evil that lies at the heart of the United States.
Mr. Rushkin, you are a former police officer, and how do you look at the case? Do you think there is a police brutality against African Americans?
No, I think that this is a case. I think you have to look at each case individually. This is a case that was captured on video conducting an arrest in which they killed a man, and that can't be taken lightly. The fact of the matter is, you know, you're going to have, in millions and millions of police officers, you're going to have cases in which the police do things wrong and commit crimes and have to be held accountable for that.
Andy, so what do you think? As Mr. Rushkin just mentioned, there are police interactions with suspects all over America, and is this just an isolated case? Do people overread into this?
Well, I think if we just look at the news reports, I would say that this is not an isolated case. You know, for decades going back, this has been reported certainly in the U.S. print media. Of course, in the age of television, we see more of this. Ferguson, Missouri, I think was one example as well that also resulted in riots. Rodney King being beaten by the police in Los Angeles also triggered riots. So I think that you know, our guest that just spoke makes a very good point that we do need to acknowledge, is that of course it's not every police officer that engages in this behavior, but to say that it's an isolated incident might not be correct either, because I think that most people do agree there is a pattern, and the police officers engaging in this kind of conduct Of course, they shouldn't be, but maybe are more a symptom of a larger problem, which I think many, not just in the United States, but around the world, are coming to recognize as the systemic abuse of human rights in the United States.
And that symptom has also produced a lot of consequences. The conservative activist and also Trump supporters, Candace Owens, has been slammed as a white supremacist and racist for declaring George Floyd to be neither a martyr nor a hero. So how do you look at George Floyd? Because, of course, he died because of the police overuse of force, but can we regard him as a hero?
Are you asking me, Tolia?
Yes, Andy?
I probably would not refer to him as a hero either, in that the classic sense of a hero is someone who knowingly and willingly sacrifices themselves for a cause greater than himself or herself. So we think of soldiers on the battlefield, or we think of firefighters rushing in to save someone from a burning building. I think that to call George Floyd a martyr perhaps would make sense, because I don't think he had the intention of sacrificing his life for this cause of Black Lives Matter, or to help address some of the structural inequalities in American society. I would probably describe him as a victim and a martyr, but perhaps not necessarily a hero.
Because what is behind this is actually whether the police officers have racist inclinations all across America. According to CNN, statistics comparisons show that police in U.S. Typically shoot, arrest, and imprison more people than other developed nations, and also they incarcerated more Black Americans, African Americans than white Americans, 4 times more likely to use force on Black people than white. Do you think this is a systematic racism in the law enforcement?
Well, you know, I think just as we can think of the individual actions of some police officers as the symptom of a larger problem, I think we can also look at the police department's, the institutional, perhaps, biases also as symptoms of a larger problem, which again, I think spans centuries in the United States, which began with the arrival of enslaved African Americans about 400 years ago, and really has played a very central role in the establishment and in the economic success of the United States. But I think, moreover, it was a deliberate policy choice of the United States that this creation of a class of second-class citizens, African Americans, where slavery, of course, many countries and societies around the world had slavery in the past, but what makes, I think, the U.S. version of it unique is that it's race-based, meaning that African Americans, clearly identifiable by skin color, certain features, were slaves. So what that meant was that you were a slave, your children would be slaves, your grandchildren would be slaves, and that this created a permanent underclass, which the U.S. still struggles with today, which I think the police departments, perhaps over-policing of African American communities, as well as the behavior of individual officers, are manifestations or a symptom of this.
You said this is a deliberate policy choice, but Lincoln ended slavery system in the 19th century, and then the blacks can vote for political offices, and the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, already 60 years have passed. Why you say it is a deliberate policy choice?
Sure. So what I mean by that, Zhou, is one of the most important tasks for any government or any country is to maintain unity of its people. And I think what the U.S. In its early days recognized that with a fairly diverse group of white people, that one way to maintain unity among the whites was that even if the lowest and the most disadvantaged of the whites could still see themselves as better and sharing similarities with their white brethren in contrast to the enslaved African Americans, that would create a sense of unity. And in this sense, the freedom that the U.S. talks about really could only be possible for white people by the mistreatment and the enslavement of black people in the United States.
But what does it take to change the mindset, the values, and the philosophies of some of the white Americans towards black Americans?
Well, I think this is the central question. And even Abraham Lincoln struggled with this, because while some historians might question how far he wanted to go, but to treat African Americans as full-fledged citizens of the United States with equal rights, of course provoked a very powerful and violent backlash in the South. And what happened afterwards was, I think, that the U.S. government essentially made a decision that they would rather have a reconciliation between the northern whites and the southern whites at the expense of the African Americans. So in a sense, giving the southern states the right to recreate conditions of slavery as much as possible, but through legal means. So these so-called Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, et cetera, other means, legislative and judicial means of keeping blacks as second-class citizens. But this was also complemented by essentially terrorist organizations engaging in extrajudicial killing, maiming, and terrorization of blacks as well.
But it seems this incident has also forced many Americans to revisit their history. HBO Max removed the 1939 film Gone with the Wind from the library because of the death of George Floyd, and the statue of Robert Lee was pulled down in the South, in Richmond. It seems that they want to have a second thoughts about the Confederate period of the United States. And do you think this kind of reaction is appropriate, is constructive?
I think it certainly represents an admirable impulse, because these are symbols of inequality that have caused pain and psychological trauma to African Americans, as well as non-blacks that are sympathetic to how African Americans have been treated. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But to only stop there, I think, would be far from sufficient, because we look at even after the Civil Rights Act, I think for many Americans, African Americans still have a second-class status when we look at, say, average wealth, income, even health indicators, life expectancy, things like that. And they still suffer to a degree from different kinds of segregation, like what we used to be called redlining, where banks would not lend to people buying property in certain areas that were quote-unquote redlined because they were seen as predominantly African American. So that kept many African Americans from owning their homes, which is such a key part of the American dream.
Don't you think for those Southerners it's a contradiction of the freedom of expression principle in the U.S.? They want to keep their part or their version of history alive as well.
I think that is true, and of course the U.S. is such a large, diverse country. There are many points of view about any subject, but I think especially as controversial a subject as race relations in the United States, and specifically the treatment and the status of African Americans. I think we can see a very, very wide range of views.
And we have Kimberly on the line. Kimberly Brown, Pelham Assistant Professor of History at Florida A&M University. So Kimberly, do you see this, this recent death of George Floyd as a result of racism or a law enforcement going awry?
Both. Both. The two are deeply tied to one another, unfortunately, in the United States. And so you can't divorce racism from this issue at all, especially as it relates to how these matters are not resolved. Unfortunately, we've seen case after case after case whereby no one is held responsible for the murders of Black people. And so absolutely racism is tied to this issue. I don't see how anybody could argue otherwise.
This has resulted in some rethinking and soul-searching of the police branch of the United States. And do you think the pushes for police reform, the banning of chokeholds by police, or even defunding and dismantling of police forces are a proportionate response to what happened in Minneapolis?
It's absolutely a reasonable response, but I do think it depends on the community that you're talking about. In many instances, there is no need for the militarization of police forces, and there is an absolute need for a reinvestment of funds into those communities as it relates to jobs, education, healthcare, etc. And so dismantling police forces, I don't know if anybody's actually calling for a total abortion of police, but rather a reimagining of public safety.
But what about those deeper problems, the racial divisions in terms of economic opportunities, social status, chances for a better life? How can America address those problems which have been bothering your country for more than a century?
I think you have to consult history on that. And I also think that you have to be realistic about what America is and how it operates. Slavery in and of itself is a capitalistic system, and America runs on money now. And so there has to be an economic reckoning for this. There has to be a reinvestment into Black communities and specifically Black institutions. And the second thing that I would say in terms of any kind of resolution on this is that Black people know that their lives matter. We don't need to be told that. And quite frankly, I don't think many people need to be told that. I think what needs to happen is people, particularly on an institutional level, on an organizational level, on a corporate level, have to take responsibility for their own biases and really consider what they are willing to do and what they're willing to give up to make sure that everybody has access to fairness and equality.
But the message is out and loud there on the streets. Why hasn't corporate America, political elites, and the establishment done something to turn things around? It has been there for a long time.
Again, at the core of this is money. This is how the United States was built. And so it's quite frankly not in corporate interest to depart from so much of what keeps their entities intact. But I do think you're starting to see a swing in how corporations are dealing with this matter. You've seen Nickelodeon put out statements, Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company, put out a statement. A lot of pharmaceutical companies, healthcare companies, you name it, they have put out statements, and in those statements include lines about funding Black causes. So I think corporations are starting to wake up, and in the age of the internet, when you put out a statement, people are going to hold you accountable. So the future will tell us how the nation will respond and how its private businesses will respond as well.
All right, thank you, Kimberly. And Andy, what are your thoughts? People at different levels, from the bottom, from the top, have they realized this problem thoroughly? And do they have the political will and the wherewithal to deal with it?
Well, I think that's the big question on many people's minds today, is this just the typical cycle where a black man or a black person is beaten or killed by the police? There are riots, there's outrage, but then after a while it dies down. And again, I mentioned Rodney King as an example of that, which happened quite a while ago, but we've seen this cycle repeat. The question then is, are we at a point where there will be true structural changes in the United States? And I think the question, though, is that there really is, this will be very, very difficult, because in order for that to happen, mostly white people, and here not necessarily meant by the color of one's skin, but the people that are part of this overclass, will lose very important prerogatives and a lot of the benefits, so-called white privilege. And if history has shown us anything, is that people rarely will give up prerogatives on their own, whether that's through revolution, whether that's through some sort of coercive force that this happens. So I think this is the big question mark that we have to see.
Well, you talk about prerogatives. Compared with other minority groups, Asian Americans seems to be less vocal than others when it comes to racial injustice and police brutality. But they have their own complaints. For example, they think they're not treated equally when they're applying for Harvard. But the African Americans think the Asians are the privileged. What do you think of the other racial minorities when they're looking at this problem?
No, I think that's a good question. So I think that racism, discrimination exist across various ethnic groups in the U.S., and it's not just a U.S. problem. I think, in a sense, people tend to be more comfortable and treat better people they think are like themselves. But when we look at the U.S. context, I think that Asian Americans generally have been subject to, perhaps we could call it, a softer form of racism or discrimination, meaning you mentioned, for instance, equal access to promotion opportunities. In places like Silicon Valley, many Asian Americans believe, and there are documented data showing this, that they hit a glass ceiling and they're not able to rise above a certain level, and education discrimination. But I think Asian Americans have been subject to much less physical violence than when we look at, say, African Americans. And I would put African Americans in a very unique category when we look at racial discrimination in the United States. And again, it goes back 400 years to the enslavement of African Americans and the importance of the mistreatment of African Americans to making freedom and the fruits of democracy that others have enjoyed.
We have Mary Curtis joining us on the line. Mary, let's look at the political ramifications of George Floyd's death. And President Trump and his government have sought to label protesters as far-left organizations they call Antifa. That's not even an organization. It's simply short for anti-fascist. Why do you think Trump is doing this?
Well, I think it fits in general with the positions of his administration and his own history. He has thought, they have arrested some right-wing and white supremacist folks that have a history here in this country. And we see that they are taking advantage of some of these protests. But as far as the Trump administration is concerned, when they had the demonstrations in Charlottesville over the removal of Confederate statues, he actually said of the counter-protesters and the protesters, the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists, that they were good people on both sides. So he has a troubled history of his own of saying and doing insensitive things when it comes to progressives and African Americans. And so he is trying to put this present situation into the narrative of his administration.
Okay, we have also collected opinions and views on this issue on the internet. Obviously, there are a hot button issue and a lot of debates on what racism is and how we can deal with it. Silver Colley said, I know all of you wants to end racism, but BLM are not what you think it is. It is a political movement that aren't fighting racism. So Mary, let's also look at the Democratic response. Candidate Biden visited the family of George Floyd, but some very good words, but he doesn't come up with them solid policies on how to deal with racism. And people also criticize him for using this to his political advantage. What do you say to that?
Well, I think he's trying to recognize that this is not just a moment, but a movement. And he also has some troubling things in his past. But he does have some policies that are in place to try to improve the racial situation. And I think he would point to the fact that when he was vice president with Barack Obama, that the Obama administration had started to put some things in place, like consent decrees with police departments that had had problems, and they wanted to help reform that. And when the Trump administration came in, they actually threw all those decrees out. And I think it's a recognition. It's difficult when you talk about racism. Many Americans want to say, well, you know, I'm not racist. I'm fine, without recognizing it's a system that's been in place, obviously, as your previous guest said, hundreds of years. And it's not so much just saying I'm not a racist person, but it's saying what kind of improvements are we going to do that have been generations in the making, whether it's law enforcement and policing, or even health care and health situations, because we see that African Americans have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus pandemic, or whether it's schooling and having equities in schools or housing. So I think Biden is at least recognizing that he needs plans in place that will do this. And it's interesting because it seems like the moment is moving so quickly that the politicians are scrambling to kind of react. And the public is demanding that it's not just about George Floyd and this one situation and policing, but it's about all the systems in this country that would lift all Americans up to a point of equality.
And not just Americans, Andy, the protests also spread to Europe, particularly the United Kingdom, France. Why there is an international aspect of this issue?
Well, I think part of it is, again,
Andy, please.
Sure. I think part of it is due to technology. So with social media, with smartphones, these images are just so shocking, so outrageous, that I think any decent-minded person cannot be furious and outraged to see this. I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it, too, is it's also a reaction against the hypocrisy of the United States.
All right. I have to leave you there. I hate it. We don't have more time. Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you, Andy. We have to wrap up on that. And this is Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye.